Welcome to Convergence.fm. I'm your host, Ashok Sivanand. On the show, we explore how purpose-driven leaders align their culture, operations, and experimentation to de-risk the decisions that really matter and lead AI-enabled businesses with clarity. Convergence.fm. Transform from the inside out. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. Something that I've really loved in this new era of our work, working directly with mid-market business owners and CEOs, is that we get to work directly with operators that have really sharp insights. They have a pretty good sense on what's working in their business and what's going to help them get to their vision faster, but also what kind of constraints and choke points are holding them back. And you might have a couple of these ideas around choke points yourself. They come up in level 10 meetings, maybe budget reviews, but you end up putting them on the back burner whenever you have to jump back into firefighting mode, whether it's to fix the sales pipeline, resolve a vendor issue, maybe an HR challenge that pops up. Your team too ends up bike shedding. You solve the problems you know how to solve and the familiar, and you back burner the big ideas. Maybe it's because they harness technology or AI or something else that's unfamiliar for you. Well, welcome back to Convergence.fm, folks. I want to talk about this and why that keeps happening, and how you could start small, build momentum into something that's really meaningful without overcommitting to the idea or blowing your team up. If you're listening to this, you've probably already figured out a couple of those things that you're aware of in your business that feel like those choke points, those things you wish you could wave a magic wand around. You maybe even have a hunch that AI automation could help, or maybe it's rethinking your workflow entirely. And in order to start going about solving it, you and your team have scratched beyond the surface. You listen to podcasts and you drive in like this one. You might have seen another operator or your peer mention this in a forum group or at a conference. You may have even switched to AI and asked ChatGPT or Claude a few exploratory questions late at night. But these things don't gain traction for some reason. But don't worry, you're not alone. And part of this is overwhelm. Part of it too is that maybe your team doesn't love it when you fly in with a new idea when they're still grappling with the last one that you brought in from forum, and you're a little afraid to bring something new up with them. This pattern we noticed 3 different times just last week. And I think all the cases we tend to overthink and underact. And that tends to be a little bit of what stops us from building momentum. At the end of the day, you want to build something meaningful in your business and have an important improvement. And at the same time, you're worried that it'll introduce some kind of instability somewhere else. Like if you push here, what might break over there? If we go out and start experimenting a lot, does that distract from our core? Does that compromise our quality? And then what would a failed implementation around something like this do for your credibility as a leader, your staff morale, consequences around the trust your customers have with you? These are pretty common fears that are holding owners back. And that structure around improving one thing while worrying about something else getting worse, let's call it a contradiction for the rest of this episode, because I think this framing matters. Because most teams are unconsciously trying to locally optimize somewhere when instead of solving a contradiction that is a little bit more comprehensive, that you can feel more trust around. You either pick safety or you pick ambition. Rarely do we step back and design around the tension of this contradiction itself. Something that's helpful here was brought up by last week's guest, Ivan Gecht, where he talked about the theory of inventive problem solving, or TRIZ, T-R-I-Z, as it's called in the Soviet Union, where it was invented by studying tens of thousands of patents and arriving at some pretty cool innovation principles. The first is that your ideation tends to predictively drive more outcomes when you define your ideas as contradictions and then try to resolve the contradiction. Let's put that into context. Say you're running a search engine, whether it's Google or Bing. The simple basic way would be to say, let's try and increase ad spend or ad revenue. Instead, if you set it as a contradiction, as saying, let's increase monetization per search session without decreasing long-term customer trust, that becomes to sound more like a contradiction. Because as you can imagine, the obvious move would be to just flood the search results with sponsored results. But that's going to erode trust. It's going to reduce your perceived quality of search. And in the long term, it's going to have negative impacts on your business. So once this contradiction is stated, the real question becomes, what level of solution can we apply to solve this? This is another place where I think TRIZ is really helpful because it's got different levels that you can apply that are based on how big of a problem you're trying to solve. Level 1, for example, is simple. You apply known fixes. You add maybe a few more sponsored listings and high intent searches, and you're turning this knob inside the existing system to drive up revenue a little bit more. Level 2 is refinement with better tools. So this is getting into the algorithms, improving targeting, ranking with the same number of ads. It's the same structure, but better math engines running it. Level three, I think, is where it gets interesting. You borrow from other industries. Now you start importing ideas from adjacent fields once you understand the problem well enough. You might bring in auction theory from financial markets to dynamically price attention in real time. Or you could borrow from like Airbnb and Uber type marketplaces to manage the supply and demand of the sponsored results and ad inventory a little bit smarter. You could also borrow from maybe retail theory and figure out where eye tracking would want the most sponsored results to fall. And this maybe won't compromise trust like the best positioned things in your grocery store. Then we get to level 4, which is more structural. This is redesigning, and this could be maybe having the ads and the answers all contextually integrated rather than visually separated. And now you're starting to change the experience, the architecture of the system. The stakes, of course, are a lot more higher here. So you want to make sure that it's worth it to pursue a level 4 solution. And then level 5 is paradigm level, right? Where instead of keyword search, you're replacing it with generative LLM interfaces like Google and Bing have moved to. And they synthesize answers and they're figuring out how to monetize this conversational intent. This is beyond optimization and it's redefining what search is. And what I think is helpful with these levels is you can do a self-check. I think most companies, ourselves included, make one of two mistakes. Sometimes we treat a level 1 problem like it deserves a level 4 revolution because we fall in love with the idea of the solution instead of thinking about the problem. Or sometimes something is level 4 of a problem and then we just try to work harder and apply level 1 or 2 thinking. The power of thinking in these levels, I think, is that it really forces you to ask whether you're over-engineering out of excitement or whether you're underreacting maybe to something that actually could be much bigger in your business. I think that question alone is hard to answer, but can save you months of wasted motion. Now, a couple of episodes ago, you may have caught one where I talked about an AI-based app we built to help measure the amount of precious metals in a warehouse. In case you didn't catch it, I'll summarize the relevant part. There was a logistics and warehousing company that was about to lose maybe $200,000 a month over a dispute around who should be measuring the cable diameters. And these cables were split across 5,000 pallets across the country. It definitely felt like a computer vision, AI tech project that could be big built. So this is where instead of designing this ideal system, we looked at what the contradiction was. They needed something that was more accurate than the human measurement, but they needed it fast and cheap because they had a really strict deadline and a pretty tight budget here. So this ruled out level 4 thinking immediately. This wasn't something about reinventing the business problem off the get-go. It was, can we resolve this constraint fast enough to avoid this $200K loss that they were up against? Since both time and urgency here, and cost of labor, frankly, were working against us, there was only so much we could gain by adding more people to measure this faster, doing these manual measurements, or by providing them with more expensive micrometers because they still had to do a bunch of manual process faster. So what we did was we built a solution that they could take photos along with a reference 3x5 inch index card that counted pixels of the index card and then counted pixels of the cable. And it was something that was built within 3 days. It was way cheaper for them to implement. And we were able to meet both sides of the contradiction of the accuracy as well as the speed and time. And the fact that it took only 3 days to get a working prototype validating that this was actually feasible got them to initially save $150,000 right there, and then validated putting more investment behind this to turn it into a more ongoing solution. The reason that I think this matters more today is around speed of learning. With being able to prototype so quickly, your competitors don't need to build perfect systems. They just need to learn faster than you. If they're diagnosing their contradictions early and starting at the appropriate level, they'll have the opportunity to iterate past you while you're still debating how to get started or designing the perfect solution. Waiting doesn't help you preserve stability here. It's going to preserve your ignorance. And I think we're in a world where ignorance is compounding a lot faster than it did before. So if you're sitting in an idea that feels stuck, I think you should ask yourself, what exactly is the contradiction? And share that with your team so you have a bunch of folks who can help you ideate. If you improve X, are we afraid Y will get worse? What's the lowest level of intervention that you can test whether this tension is real or imagined and whether you can start moving the needle on solving it? Instead of getting bogged down by a full roadmap or a big transformation towards AI, just figure out a small contradiction that you can start working on that you can test today. I don't think most business owners need more ambition. I think it's smaller, reversible first steps that they can take so they can iterate fast. If you've got an idea that you feel like is stuck, that you're overthinking, underacting, or figuring out how to define a contradiction, or even what level of solutioning from TRIZ you want to apply, send us an email to officehours@convergence.fm and send us just 3 things. The idea or the choke point you're solving, how you think this is going to change your business, and what kind of things you're afraid might break if you start to work towards it. That's it. Within a half hour, maybe 45 minutes, we can help you define a contradiction, whether it's a level 1, a level 3, and what kind of escalation it truly warrants. You don't need certainty to start. You need clarity around the problem. You need to define a contradiction, and you can start experimenting. And I think that's a much more manageable way to get started with way better downside protection. If you want a deeper dive into the theory of inventive problem solving or TRIZ and how contradictions drive innovation, check out the full episode that we did with Ivan Gecht, G-E-K-H-T, where we went much further into the philosophy and have a ton of examples from the industry as well as from Ivan's experience. Just remember that the goal isn't to build something transformational at first, is to define the contradiction and start to resolve it. As I've mentioned before, start small, start now, and start with yourself. If I don't hear from you about the office hours, we'll see you next week on another episode of Convergence.fm. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.